Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in. This is our ninth live stream here on YouTube. We are Holy Tisch, which is a content and event platform centered around the future of food. We have a big event in September. Our Future Food Convention is taking place from the 16th to the 18th September, 100% virtual. If you like to be up to date, subscribe to our YouTube channel and newsletter. Please have in mind that this is an interactive interview model, so you are very welcome to post or comment some questions if you like in this YouTube chat. My name is Joella, and this is my colleague Martin, who will introduce our very special guest today.
All right, so we have a special guest today that I want to talk a little bit, talk about a small story that I experienced. I found his book on an ebook platform. I was just browsing through and saw a picture of bumblebees, and then I read through the content, and then I started reading this book, and I got involved in Holy Tisch, and I felt like this would be really nice because we were asking ourselves, who do we know who could talk about bees or bumblebees, insects, and then I was already reading this book, and Dave Goulson wrote the book. A Sting in the Tail is the English title, and we got together, and he was happy enough to come and join us today, and he will be speaking at our convention as well. Today we will be focusing a little bit more on the person and see how he got where he is right now, and then at the convention he will be speaking more about the topic of insect life and how we can contribute and make changes in that matter. So welcome, Dave. Hello.
Hi. How you doing?
Oh.
Do you want to talk a little bit about yourself? Just give a rough bio maybe, so that the people who don't know who you are have a better picture.
Of course, yeah. So my name's Dave Goulson. I'm professor of biology at the University of Sussex in the south of England, and I've spent the last 30 years, I guess, studying bees, wild bees, mainly bumblebees. And I guess more recently I got involved in research on the impacts of pesticides and the way we farm on bees and more broadly on insects, which is something sorry, I'm rambling already. And I guess as I've also become more and more involved over time in outreach to try and actually do something about the ongoing declines of insects.
I watched one of your talks and was pretty impressed because I think it's not known for everybody that bumblebees or bees have such a great biodiversity, that there's so many different species. I think you said something about 250 different species.
Very good. Yeah, in the UK we have 26. I think it's about 60 in Europe, 250 in the world, mostly in the colder part. They're quite weird, and I could talk for hours about bumblebees, but you'd get very bored. But
No.
They're really weird insects because they're big and furry as an adaptation to living in fairly cold climates. So most insects are most common in tropical parts of the world. You know, there are more species of grasshopper or butterfly or whatever in warmer regions than in colder regions. But bumblebees are unusual. You don't find them in the tropics, really. It's too hot for them. They like to live in cold, windy places like the United Kingdom, and they live right up into the Arctic Circle. There's a bumblebee called Bombus pilaris, the polar bumblebee, which has its whole life cycle inside the Arctic Circle, and it can fly around when the temperature can be freezing. But this little bee with its fur coat and being relatively big for a bee can manage to generate its own heat by shivering and keep warm and keep active when really nothing else can fly. So they're fascinating in lots of other ways too, but unusual in that respect.
When I read your book, I got the impression that you were interested in all sorts of animals and like were open to, like, your life could have been like, you could have been any expert probably on anything, like from reading your book. How did it happen that you kind of drilled down on insects and then narrowed even further to bumblebees? Is there anything where you can say that happened, or is it just like one action led to another and then?
No, I mean, it's my whole life has been a series of accidents, really. I didn't plan anything. Um, I, as you say, I just loved wildlife from an early age, and I guess I think the thing I liked about insects was that you could get really close to them. You could hold them in your hand. You could pick them up and look at them. I spent a year or two trying to become a bird watcher, but found it really frustrating that they just kind of flew off, and I could never quite be sure what it was I'd seen. Whereas with the insects, yeah, you know, you could get much closer. But my first love were butterflies and moths. I used to breed butterflies and moths, you know, find caterpillars and rear them up and see what they turned into and that kind of thing. Even when I was only 5 or 6 years old, I remember collecting caterpillars and rearing them. But then later, I started studying bumblebees later in life when I was in my 20s. And that was, this is a bit of a long anecdote, but basically I was working at a university. I was trying to develop a research program of my own, and didn't quite know what I was doing, if I'm honest. And I was sitting in a little nature reserve, idly watching bees. I didn't really know much about them at the time. And I noticed something odd, which was that if you and anyone can see this, so if you go outside, don't go right this minute because you'll miss the rest of this chat, but in a little while, and just find a patch of flowers with a bee but flying around. Doesn't have to be a bumblebee, but that was what I was watching. If you see the bee flies from flower to flower, but she doesn't land on every flower. She'll very commonly fly right up to the flower, and at the last second, she veers away as if there's something wrong with it. And they do this all the time. You can see it very easily. And I thought it was odd because, oh, what's wrong with the flowers that they're not landing on? So I started studying it, and it turned out that nobody knew the answer, and it took about 5 years to get to the bottom of it. And what actually they're doing is they fly up and they sniff the flower with their antennae out, and what they're sniffing for is the faint whiff of a previous bee having recently landed on that flower. So every time a bee lands on a flower and touches the petals, she leaves behind a little smear of oils from her cuticle, just like when we hold a glass and we leave an oily fingerprint on the glass. It's not deliberate, obviously, but so they accidentally leave behind a sign that they've been there. And a subsequent bee uses that to indicate that that flower is empty, because if a bee's recently landed on it, the previous bee will have taken the nectar, so there's no point in landing. So they'll skip that and try and find a flower that hasn't been visited recently. So this sounds really obscure stuff, I guess, but it took me 5 years to get to the bottom of this. And by the end of it, I was hooked. The bumblebees are really clever. They're kind of like the intellectual giants of the insect world. That's just one of many kind of tricks that they have that enable them to find the most rewarding flowers and navigate between the flower patches and their nest, and do lots of other things too. And their whole lives are really quite complicated, you know, because they're social creatures. They live in a colony with the queen and workers and so on. They're just fascinating, and there's lots we still don't know about them. Plenty enough to keep me busy for the next few decades.
But this leads for me already to one question: if the bees are so picky, or if the bees need their one flower, you actually need a lot of flowers for them.
Yeah, so I mean, this relates back to what we were talking about a minute ago about them being able to keep warm and fly in cold places. And they do that by generating their own heat internally, but that's really expensive in terms of energy. So someone once worked out that a running man burns the calories in a Mars bar in about an hour of running, which is quite depressing statistic if you're running to lose weight. But that if you had a man-sized bumblebee flying along, that would burn the calories in a Mars bar in 30 seconds. So they need loads of energy, and that's all comes from the nectar in flowers. So they need lots of flowers, and if there aren't enough flowers, and the flowers are too far apart in the landscape, then they just run out of energy and they're doomed at that point. You know, they once a bee can't get warm enough to fly and has to walk, she's never going to find flowers. So, and that's a real issue in the modern world, because we've created a world where mostly there aren't many flowers, and that's one of the big problems that bees face, unfortunately.
So the question that I have when I hear this is that if you have such a high amount of calories that you're burning as the bumblebees, they want to return to the hive with like surplus. So how do they do it if they burn it all, like if they burn it on their way back, for example, or something?
Well, so their whole life is kind of living on a knife edge. You know, they have to be really good. They have to be able to remember which flowers are most rewarding and exactly where they are, so they don't waste time getting lost when they're navigating to and from the flower patches. And they also they learn to extract the rewards very quickly. So every flower is a different shape, different design. And the nectar might be in a different place, so they become very good at it, basically. And you know, they've been visiting flowers, bees generally, for 120 million years, so they're quite skilled at doing what they do. And so as long as there's a reasonable number of flowers in the landscape, then they do somehow manage to make a profit. The abdomen of the bee is full of I think the honey stomach, a big sac, and they can carry nearly their own weight in nectar if they can find enough of it. And so every time a bee leaves the nest, she has to, her mission is to come back with a profit, with more sugar than she burned on the way flying around, and they usually do, but increasingly in the modern world they struggle.
And that's maybe also the next point, because if the plants are full of pesticides and then the bees or the bumblebees come there to pick up, then they're doomed as well, right?
Yeah, so I mean, this is in farmland, there aren't many flowers, and sadly when there are flowers, there's a pretty good chance they'll be contaminated with pesticides. And often the amounts of pesticides are quite small, but even tiny amounts that are too low to kill bees can still do them harm. And there was a long and kind of a complicated story surrounding a group of insecticides called neonicotinoids, which became kind of notorious eventually for the harm they do to bees. But the problem with those was that they're very poisonous to bees and they can kill bees, but at lower doses, really tiny doses. Most pesticides are neurotoxins, so they attack the brain of the bee. And I was just saying, bees are really clever and they have to be very efficient at collecting food. They have to remember exactly where the flowers are and how to get the rewards. If when they visit the flowers and drink the nectar, they get slightly poisoned with these neurotoxins, it impairs their brain function, and it means they can't navigate so well. So one of the things that emerged was that they then get lost on their way back to the hive, which is disastrous for a bee. If she can't find her hive, she might as well be dead. And these, as they're called, sublethal effects, hadn't really been studied before in bees, and they're not. So the regulatory process which a new chemical has to go through before it's allowed for farmers to use it doesn't consider these sublethal effects at all. It looks at basically what dose of this chemical kills bees. Are they likely to get that dose? If they're not, then that's fine. But actually, much lower doses can be harmful, it turns out, because they mess up the bee's brain. And that's a lesson that it kind of we have learned in recent years, but we haven't acted on because the regulatory process for pesticides hasn't actually changed. So some new bunch of chemicals that are just as harmful in that respect as neonicotinoids might come along and replace them, and there's nothing at present to stop that from happening, which is a bit worrying.
That's so horrible.
And I was just thinking about like the Bumblebee Conservation Trust that you initiated. Was that one of the reasons why you initiated it, or was like, is it like to educate people and to look like into that?
So yeah, I started this charity back in 2006. It was nothing to do with pesticides. I didn't work on pesticides at the time at all. Um, but it was because I'd been an academic at that point for, you know, a scientist studying bees for, I don't know, you know, nearly 20 years, I suppose. Um, and and it was clear that bees were declining, wild bees in particular. Uh, and we've done some research on, you know, what might be done about it, particularly ways that you could put more flowers back into the landscape and things like that. But you know, most scientists, they do their research and then they publish papers in really obscure scientific journals that nobody reads. Many of them are hidden behind paywalls anyway, and even if you can access them, they're written in a kind of technical language which is really inaccessible to anybody who hasn't got a degree in science. So the whole system's a bit silly, really, very insular, and it was really frustrating that we were doing this work. We had a pretty good idea of some of the things that needed to be done, but nobody was taking the science and doing anything with it, acting on it. So I thought, well, if nobody else is doing it, you know, perhaps we should do it ourselves. And so I started this charity, the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, which is kind of self-explanatory, really. The title, you know, explains what it's trying to do. And it's all about trying to prevent these ongoing declines and ideally reverse them and prevent any more species from going extinct by actually doing real world stuff, you know, which I mean, the charity does lots of different things, but perhaps its biggest focus is on creating more habitat for bees, replanting some of the flower-rich meadows that we used to have, and also trying to influence government policy so that farmers generally are encouraged to do more for pollinators, putting in more flowers, using fewer pesticides, those kinds of issues. And also more generally educating people, trying to reach out to the general public and explain to them why we should care about these little creatures because of all the amazing stuff they do for us, and also because they're fascinating in their own right. And the charity has been great. You know, I don't have any direct involvement anymore. I ran it for the first 5 years. And then sort of stood back, but it's got about 40 staff and offices all over the UK, and it's been involved in loads of great projects that you can walk into a field full of flowers that wouldn't have been there if we hadn't created it. So you know, that's really nice. It's not enough, you know. We haven't really achieved enough to make a difference at the big scale. But at least there's been some kind of, you know, some really nice small successes, and you know, we're doing as much as we can, and it's actually much more rewarding getting involved in that kind of thing, I think, or from my perspective, compared to just being a scientist and publishing boring, stuffy papers that nobody reads, you know.
Are you focusing mainly, when you talk about creating new habitats for the insects, are you focusing mainly on countrysides or also in cities and urban areas, or both?
So both, really. I mean, I you know, there's these big kind of there's a lot of environmental issues that we're all concerned about at the moment, or we should be concerned about. You know, climate change and deforestation of the rainforests and so on, all these kind of big issues. But most people feel helpless about, you know, what can you really do about tigers or polar bears or pandas? But with insects, they live all around us. You know, there are thousands of species living in cities. So if people have got any kind of garden, even a small one, they can actually get involved themselves. So they can feel kind of empowered. You know, they can invite insects in to live in their gardens, in their backyards. So I'm really keen on promoting and encouraging that as at least something that we can do quite easily. It's a bit of an open door because I think people want to help. There's a lot of people out there really keen to make their garden a bit wilder, fill it with wildflowers and so on. I'm sorry, this is terrible, but I'm going to plug my book at this point. Yes. So this is the German version of my latest book, Wildlife Gardening, it's called in Germany, which is all about basically how to make your garden insect friendly and sort of also about how we can tread a bit more gently on the planet, growing our own food and things like that. So we could do a lot with gardens. You know, I don't know a figure for Germany, but in the UK, there are about 500,000 hectares of gardens, which, you know, imagine if they were all full of insect-friendly flowers and nobody was using pesticides, that would be a big step forwards. And if you could add to that, if you could persuade the local councils to change the way they manage parks, to encourage insects and change the way cemeteries are managed and road verges and roundabouts and all the other green spaces, that would kind of connect up the gardens. And then, you know, you've got a sort of national network of insect-friendly habitat, which would be brilliant. But it still doesn't tackle the bigger issue of farming, because, again, I don't know the UK figure, but it's probably broadly similar. Of the UK is farmland, and I would guess a similar proportion of Germany is farmland, roughly. You know, it's the biggest land use, and unfortunately, modern farming is fairly hostile to life, really, to insect life, certainly, and generally to biodiversity. We've gone down a route of farming, this sort of industrialized, mechanized farming with huge fields treated over and over again with lots of pesticides and fertilizers, which creates a landscape which just has nothing to offer for butterflies or bumblebees or birds or anything else. And so I mean, I personally think that we need to radically change farming, that the current system is broken. It's doing terrible damage to the environment. It's wiping out biodiversity. It's eroding the soils and causing soils to lose carbon and wash into rivers and so on. It's adding a lot to climate change. It's polluting streams and so on with fertilizers and pesticides. It's basically not sustainable, I don't think. And also it's producing food that mostly isn't very healthy. You know, when you look at in the UK and most of Germany, we have huge areas of grains and oil crops, most of which are used to produce foods that basically aren't very good for us. You know, heavily processed flour-based foods like cakes and biscuits, pizzas, pasta, pastries, and so on, all of which are actually pretty bad for us and are contributing to a global epidemic of obesity, which is incredibly expensive and harmful, you know, causing immense health problems globally. In the UK, it's estimated that obesity is costing the economy £27 billion a year, so roughly the same in euros. So it's a lot of money. So we've got this bizarre system which is destroying the environment and making us ill at the same time. And we know we should eat more fruits and vegetables, but we don't grow them. There aren't enough fruits and vegetables in the world to give everyone a healthy diet. We're not growing enough of them, but there's way more grain and oil than we need. So the whole thing is ridiculous, I think. You've got me off on a bit of a rant here, but and I think there are much better ways to feed everybody. But it would require, ideally, quite radical change, and achieving that is really difficult. You know, persuading politicians that the whole current system of farming is wrong and we need to do it completely differently. That's a big step, and the farmers themselves are going to be reluctant to. Nobody likes change, do they? Not that kind of change. So it's good. It's a real challenge. But if we don't tackle farming, then we're going to lose most of life on Earth ultimately. So, you know, it couldn't be a much bigger issue, really, could it? You know, we need to work out how to feed everyone a healthy diet without destroying the planet. And we need to do it by growing food in a way that kind of works with nature, that supports biodiversity rather than just trying to wipe biodiversity out and replace it with huge stands of crops, which is what we're doing at the moment.
What would you think? What would be your suggesting? Starting to convince the farmers to farm organically, for example, starting to convince the politician to do different laws, or starting at the consumer to buy other stuffs, or everybody at the same time?
I think, I mean, my strategy is everything. I think we need to, to try and educate everybody that we need to change. And all of those are ways we could change. I mean, obviously farmers could change on their own, but they're unlikely to unless either the market for their food changes, or the subsidy system changes, and the rules that government set. Government could easily change everything, and one of the interesting aspects of this is that in Europe, the Common Agricultural Policy, which, I mean, is an immensely boring subject, really, but basically farming is hugely subsidized in Europe, and taxpayers have subsidized the industrialization of farming. It was all the Common Agricultural Policy was intended to ensure food security, and that farmers could make a living, and it was really born out of the food shortages after the Second World War, and it probably made sense in 1950 or 60 or 70 to be focused on ensuring that we had enough food, and people were used to rationing and all these kind of things, but that's pretty ancient history, and it's time we moved on. But because there is this Europe-wide policy that basically directs farming with public money, if that were completely changed, you could completely direct farming in another direction. You could just to take a very simplistic example, you could say from now on we will only give subsidies to organic farmers. Bang, within a very small number of years, every farmer would be organic, and that would be a huge step in what I think would be the right direction. So it is within the power of the European Parliament to do this single-handedly if they could be persuaded. Or at the other end of the spectrum, if we could persuade shoppers to only buy, again, I'm not suggesting that organic food is in itself the solution. I think it's part of the solution. But if shoppers only bought organic food, again, that within a very short space of time, farmers would all switch to organic because they wouldn't be able to sell anything otherwise. So shoppers have the power to change everything, but it will only obviously work if most shoppers or a lot of shoppers change their buying practices. And that, again, that's not going to happen unless we can persuade everybody or a big proportion of the population to buy into this, to appreciate how serious this issue is. And one of the many things that's really frustrating from my perspective in the modern world is that actually most people are oblivious to, from my perspective, we face a climate crisis, which is hugely important, but also a biodiversity crisis, which is perhaps as dangerous, but not as widely recognized. And yet most people are just carrying on regardless, as if it's all fine with the world. They can carry on. They're assuming the food will always be there in the supermarkets and that their life can just carry on as normal. But actually, we can't carry on like this. We're heading for disaster, and we need to change direction. So we somehow need to get to all those people and make them realize that this is serious, that we actually have to change. We can do it, but only if, well, either government makes us or we all choose to do it, one or the other, really.
I would like to, thank you for that. That's actually something that is really important to say. I just want to take it back to where you said people, if you give them the right tools and if you give them instructions, people are very willing to accommodate that, and that there's a lot we could do. But do you have an idea of what we can actually do? Like what is hands-on, something that everybody's able is able to do financially as well as, I don't know, physically maybe, to just give a little bit what they can, like making it concrete.
Well, ideally don't make it concrete, because concrete's
yeah.
really, sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah, I mean, so it's really easy to give advice to people. If you've got any kind of garden or outdoor space, then you can make it insect friendly and do something that helps. Really simple things like not mowing your lawn so often. So actually, it saves you money, saves you time, it saves petrol. Um, uh, and most lawns are full of flowers if you just let them flower. But if you keep mowing, nothing can flower. And also, every time you mow, as well as removing all the flower buds and most of the vegetation, if any insect has been foolish enough to try and live in your lawn, you're basically hoovering them up and macerating them with the blade. Um, so my lawn, most of it I only cut once a year, and it's well, some of it's almost head high actually, but it's full of insects. It's brilliant. I love it. And not everybody's going to do that. People might say, oh, but my kids want to play football or something. Well, fine if that's true. But for many of us, we have these big green lawns that serve no real purpose at all. But somehow we're addicted to mowing, and we've got this kind of neat freak kind of mentality that we want stripes. A lot of British people love their lawns, and they try and recreate something that looks like a Wimbledon tennis court in their back garden, which it's so much effort, and they put fertilizers on it, and they put selective weed killers, and they're backwards and forwards with their lawnmower. It's just like this weird obsession. It doesn't make any sense to me. So if we could just persuade people, next time they start to twitch and think the lawn's too long, to just kind of calm down and get a deck chair out and make themselves a gin and tonic and go and sit down and just enjoy it and watch the flowers appear. So that things like that are really simple. Obviously growing the right flowers, and I could talk for hours about that.
Can I ask what would be the right flower for your balcony or for your terrace or something, or garden?
Yeah, so there's loads to choose from. I mean, I've made a lot of YouTube videos about the best flowers for bees. So if you want lots more advice than I can squeeze in now, look at those. But generally speaking, herbs and kind of what in the UK we call them cottage garden flowers, kind of old-fashioned perennial flowers, tend to be best. If you've just got a balcony, then quite a lot of herbs are really happy growing in pots. Things like marjoram, rosemary, thyme. They're all really easy to grow. They're perennial plants that you can use them in your cooking as well. So they're kind of all-round beneficial. And the marjoram in my garden at the moment is just covered in insects. They absolutely love it. So there, if that's all you've got room for, just get the biggest pot you can squeeze on your balcony and grow a nice big marjoram plant. And it's amazing that even if you're on a balcony, on the 5th floor of a block of flats in the middle of a city, you grow a nice flower like that, and somehow the insects will appear. It's amazing how they can sniff out the nectar wherever it might be. So that's great. Don't use pesticides in your garden. It's a pretty obvious one, but it really depresses me that every garden centre, even supermarkets these days, they sell this. They have shelves and shelves of pesticides that you can spray in your garden. I mean, you just don't need them. You can argue that farmers might need some pesticides. That's a good debate to be had. But there's no excuse at all. There's just no need to have them in your garden. It's just laziness, and usually I think they're actually do more harm than good. But these are basically poisons. Why on earth would you want to spend money on poison to sprinkle around in your garden where your kids play, where your pets play, where you might grow vegetables to eat yourself? It's nuts. Anyway, sorry, I going off on one, but get rid of again, save yourself money, get rid of the pesticides. There are lots of other things you can do for simple little things like a bee hotel. They work quite well, and they're easy to make, and they're fun projects to do with the kids. There's a thing called a hoverfly lagoon you can make, which again is a nice little project to provide breeding places for hoverflies. You can find advice online. Make a pond if you've got room, which is fantastic for not so much for pollinators, but for dragonflies and damselflies and pond skaters and water beetles and all sorts of other creatures. So there's loads of things you can do, and even quite a small garden can teem with life. There was a really interesting. There's this crazy lady, an English lady, who spent 30 years cataloguing all the creatures she could find in her garden. She lived in Leicester, which is a fairly big city in England, and she had a very small suburban garden. But she managed over 30 years to find 2,600 species of animals and plants. About 2,000 of them were insects, and then the rest were mainly birds and flowers. But isn't that extraordinary? 2,000 species of insect in a tiny garden. So all these creatures are there, and with a bit of encouragement, our cities could become kind of giant insect nature reserves, which I think would be pretty damn cool.
Absolutely. Also, going from the private balcony to parks. I live in Munich, and here in Munich we have the second largest city park, as I believe, after the Central Park. And if you cycle through the park, I think you cycle for about 30 minutes, and it feels like a little bit like in my favorite movie, Pride and Prejudice, because it looks like an English country park and you're all alone. And they actually do not mow that a lot, because in the last part of the city park, there are not so many people all the time. And I think they started mowing 1 week ago, so I guess that's quite good. I'm not an expert, but
yeah, that's great. And there's a bit of a battle going on at the moment, because I think there are more and more people realizing the value of leaving at least some of parks unmown, or just mowing once a year, as to leave them for wildflowers, for meadows, for insects and birds and so on. But there are also people who hate it. They're perhaps old-fashioned. They're used to the parks being mowed, and they complain. They write letters to the council saying, you're being lazy. You should be mowing the park. It looks a mess. So there's a degree to which we need to sort of re-educate people, persuade people, explain to them why it's like that. If they think it's just laziness, they're not going to like it. But if you can point out to them that actually we're doing this deliberately, it's to encourage nature, it's because there's a crisis, and these creatures need our help. So really simple things like mowing a path through the long grass and putting a sign up saying, wildflower meadow, really helps, because it explains to people why it's there. It's not just untidiness. But yeah, there's a kind of a battle going on at the moment, and we need to win it. We need to persuade people that mowing is pointless and a waste of resources unless it's absolutely necessary. And of course, if it's a football pitch, you need to mow it. But most areas don't need to be mown regularly at all. And it would be nice if we could reach a point where the normal thing to do for park managers was not to mow, apart from in the places where, people are going to play football or whatever. We've got a way to go, I think. But it sounds as if your park is already there. So fantastic.
We have such a place that you described just now, where it's just one lane, you can go through it. There's actually a bee hotel in there, then there's some explanations what's going on, which insects live in this habitat, and it had been like straight and short for almost as long as I can remember. But the question, when you were talking just now, I felt like I've thought about permaculture, and like I don't know a lot about it, but is there a common ground between like a scenario that you are describing and permaculture, using like that synergy maybe, or like these effects where you can create something with nature instead of against it?
Yeah, so my answer to this could be quite long. How long do you want?
We have 20 minutes, so you can
okay.
You can go ahead.
So I think, as I said earlier, that the current farming system is completely wrong. And you could try and sort of gradually change it by trying to wean farmers off the heavy use of pesticide, by encouraging them to use there's a thing called integrated pest management, which I'm not sure how familiar people are with it, but it's it's an approach to pest management that's been around since the 1970s, but it's really a philosophy of trying to reduce pest numbers by using lots of cultural techniques, using resistant crop varieties, using crop rotations, encouraging natural enemies of pests, and that kind of thing. Lots of other tools as well, and treating the pesticide as a last resort if everything else has failed. We could do much more of that, and I think there would be potential to greatly reduce pesticide use in modern farming if farmers were actually given support and help and advice in how to use integrated pest management. Ideally, there'd be government-funded research and then some kind of advisory service taking that information and going out to farmers and showing them how to do it, helping them. And at the moment, certainly in the UK, most of the agronomists that advise farmers work for pesticide companies. They're not independent. They're basically salesmen selling pesticides. And farmers have no real help or support in reducing pesticide use at all. Quite the opposite. They just get a lot of encouragement to use pesticides. But in theory, so that might be one option, would just be to take the current model of farming and reduce the amount of pesticides being used by introducing integrated pest management. And that would be much better than what we're doing at the moment. But I think personally, we need to do a lot more than that. And look at these really alternative ways of growing food that are completely different to the modern kind of big monoculture model. And so part of the reason I say that is because we've done some work on allotments. Do you have allotments? I'm sure I've seen allotments in Germany where basically, little pieces of rented land that people use. People who usually haven't got a garden or have only got a tiny garden, they have a piece of land which they can use for growing vegetables or whatever they want. And we've been doing some studies of allotments in the UK, and what's really interesting is they're surprisingly productive in terms of the amount of food they can produce. If it's a skilled allotmenter, he or she can get in the region of 35 tons of food per hectare of allotment. The allotments are much smaller than 1 hectare, but if you scale it up, 35 tons of fresh fruit and vegetables, 0 food miles, 0 packaging, usually 0 pesticides, because you find that most people who are growing their own food don't want to put pesticides on it. And if you compare that to industrial farming, this is where I think it gets really interesting. Wheat, which is the biggest crop in Europe, with all those pesticides and all the fertilizers, the farmer gets about 8 tons per hectare, maybe 10 if he's really, really good. And that's food that a lot of it isn't fit for human consumption. A lot of it will go to feed to animals. So actually, if you compare the two, you think, well, the allotments look pretty good. But what's more interesting is that there was a recent study published, a UK-wide study from some scientists at Bristol University, who found that the biodiversity on allotments is really high. It's actually, allotments are kind of biodiversity hotspots within cities. They have more species of insect in them than do gardens or city parks or even cemeteries or nature reserves. So you can have food production and lots of wildlife living in the same place, which is the complete opposite of what's happening in mainstream farming. And I thought that's really interesting. And I think you can scale up the same kind of approach. I mean, allotments and sort of small scale vegetable growing I think there are certain things about it which make inherent kind of ecological sense. You're growing lots of different crops rather than a monoculture, which is much harder for pests to cope with. If you just plant a sea of wheat, you're inviting pests of wheat to come and go, well, hey, and eat it all. Whereas if you're growing 20 different crops in a small area, you haven't got big expanses of food for any one insect. And because of all that diversity, you have really healthy populations of natural enemies, ladybirds, lacewings, hoverflies, and so on, that eat any pests that do appear. And most allotmenters are also very keen on looking after the soil, so they're composting and recycling nutrients and increasing the soil carbon. So you've got good fertile soils, you've got lots of natural enemies. It all kind of makes sense, and there are methods of farming that are very similar. which is where I finally get to answer your question. So permaculture and biodynamic farming, which are sort of slightly similar in many ways, but different in sort of philosophy. But they both of them often resemble an allotment. They're basically intensive fruit and veg production, sometimes with some animals thrown into the mix. But always organic and always basically using a philosophy of working with nature rather than trying to control it and kill it. And you know, I would love to see our cities surrounded by biodynamic farms, permaculture farms, growing all the fruits and vegetables that the population of the cities need. Most of our cities sprung up on quite fertile land, so the land is good for growing food. And it seems to me that, you know, in the UK, again, sorry to keep mentioning the UK, just I have the numbers in my head for the UK. We import 70% of our fruits and vegetables in a country which is pretty well suited to growing fruits and vegetables. So why on earth do we grow so much wheat and oilseed rape and not grow the fruits and vegetables that people want and that are really good for them? But instead we fly them in from South Africa or New Zealand or Chile. It doesn't make any sense at all. So I think we should move to a system of trying to get people to eat more locally grown, seasonal produce, produced near to where they live. So, you know, in my kind of dream world, that most of the fruits and vegetables that people eat would be being grown within 10 or 20 kilometers of where they live, and you could then have farmers markets in the cities where the farmers growing all these lovely fruits and vegetables brought them in, or you could have deliveries if markets are obviously a bit problematic with the current virus situation, but you could have veggie boxes, organic veggie boxes being delivered through the cities, vegetables all grown around the edges of the cities in small scale farms teeming with wildlife. I think it could be done, but you know, it obviously would require buy-in from everybody if we were to end up in a world like that. But that seems to me infinitely more sustainable than this bizarre system of agriculture we have at present.
You already answered my next question, because I wanted to ask, how do you see the possibilities of this kind of your dreamland? But you already said you think it's possible. So.
Well, it's possible, but it's persuading everyone that this is what they want. You know, and this brings us back to this age-old problem. You know, that I mean, I give talks about these things, I create YouTube videos, I write books, and so on and so on. But I always feel a bit like I'm in a bubble. You know, I'm talking to people that already agree with me on most of this. It's how do we reach everybody else that's not here, that didn't bother to tune into this YouTube channel, that would never pick up one of my books and read them, because you know they're just not engaged. They don't realize it's important, and that, you know, I think is the big challenge for all of us that are here tonight. You know, how do we tonight, this evening, whatever time of day it is, how do we connect with the majority of people that still haven't really realized that their children's future is at stake? You know, because that's what it boils down to. You know, people would do anything for their children apart from apparently leave them a decent planet to live on, which is utterly bizarre. And I think it's simply ignorance. It's not that they don't care about the future of their children. They just don't realize that, you know, what we're doing isn't sustainable. So yeah, we just need to sort of spread the word every way we can. And obviously you guys are busy trying to do that. I'm busy trying to do that. If everyone else that's listening tries to persuade their neighbors, their friends to buy into this, then, you know, I do think the world is changing. We're kind of near a tipping point, I think, where, you know, you see Extinction Rebellion, the rise of veganism, all sorts of signs that people, and especially young people, are really waking up. But we just need to accelerate it as fast as possible, because you know, time is running out, and you know, we need this to happen soon, not 20 years from now, because that'll be too late.
Do you think, as your work as a professor now, because now you can influence young people, or mostly young people, do you think they're all going to be bumblebees activists or insect activists?
I would love it, but yeah, I mean, wouldn't that be brilliant? Yes, not necessarily bumblebees or even insects, but people who care about looking after the environment at the end of the day. And I obviously, in my dream is to get everybody to buy into this, but we've still got a very, very long way to go. But we've got to keep trying.
We have 10 more minutes, and Joella, do you have any questions on the radar that we could ask? Otherwise, I would just come up with one last question.
I see here one question, but I think it was yours, Martin. And I really love it, because if you would not choose that one now, I'm gonna read it. It's maybe you answered it a little bit, but what are your utopian future outlook for humans interact coexist with insect and pollinators specifically? Maybe we can deep dive a little bit more in with the pollinators.
I don't know there's too much more I can say. I think people have the one, it's been really nice to see in the last 10 years the spreading awareness that pollinators are important. I think most people in the Western world, at least, have heard something about bees being in decline, and how and they have some inkling that that's a bad thing because they are important to pollinate crops. They don't really understand any of the details. They sometimes think there's just one species of bee and that pollinates everything. So there's some big misunderstandings out there, but people have already, I think, accepted that we need to look after pollinators. They might not be actually doing very much to help them, but the concept has got there, has reached kind of widespread recognition, which is a good start. But I'm in danger of repeating myself, but I would love it if we could somehow persuade people to kind of stop being frightened of insects, to this reaction of wanting to swat insects. Anything that buzzes near you, people react in fright. They grab the nearest buck and try and whack it, because they think it's dangerous, it's going to bite them or sting them or something. If we could persuade people to, well, I mean, ideally to love insects, but if that, that's a long way to go for some people, but at least to respect them and realize that they're important, and that, having insects in your garden is a good thing. Appreciating that actually, having wildlife in your garden adds a whole dimension to it that is missing otherwise. This sterile, kind of very neat gardens, the Wimbledon tennis court, even worse, the AstroTurf plastic grass garden, which sadly is something I've seen a lot of recently. It's just dead. There's no interest there. Having a garden that's buzzing with life is just so much more fun and interesting than having a silent plastic or sterile garden. So I'm rambling a bit, but basically just to get people to kind of open their hearts to insects and invite them to come and live with them. Wouldn't that be great? Absolutely.
There's one question from, please excuse my pronunciation, Juan Luis Celis. He says, great talk. Do you think that we should take care of the origin of the insect species? That is, prefer native or over exotic, or just focus on the ecological function independent of its origin?
Good question. So yeah, there is quite a debate about whether it's best to grow native plants in your garden, or whether it matters if you grow non-natives. I mean, I don't think there's necessarily a right answer to that. There's a little bit of scientific evidence that on average, pollinators prefer either native plants or near-native plants from similar climates and not too far away. But it's definitely true that there are also some really attractive non-native plants that pollinators absolutely love. And to tell people that they're not allowed to grow non-natives in their gardens, I think is not going to go down very well. Most people are going to ignore you if you say that. So my strategy in my own garden is to have a mixture. I try and grow native plants where I can. as well as attracting pollinators, the one distinct advantage of native plants is they may also be food plants for caterpillars or for herbivorous insects aside from pollinators. So the caterpillars of butterflies, for example, they all eat particular plants, and they'll only eat native plants. So there are advantages to having native plants, but I think it's unreasonable to tell people, that they should pull up all of the non-natives in their garden or whatever. A nice mixture of natives with some of the more attractive non-natives, I think is fine in a garden. It certainly works in my garden, and it's full of life of all sorts.
All right, thank you.
I have one personal story, and then I think we can wrap the session up. Maybe Joella has something to say in the end, but ever since I read the book, I created like a sitting structure on my balcony. I'm on the 3rd floor, and my roommate got tomatoes, and we had zucchini, and we have all these plants you talked about. And then there is these the French lilac kind of colored plants. What are they called? Like the big fields in France full of these lavender, yeah. So we have these as well, and it's just amazing. Like every time a bee or a bumblebee comes by, I'm just like, I'm so happy. And I'm that referring to as people get motivated to do more. Once you start, you get your first results, and you get visitors, and then you see how cool it is that they actually pollinated the tomatoes, and now we have these tomatoes. And having read that they taste even better when they have been pollinated by bumblebees in your book, I was just like, oh my God, this is going so well. So I feel like the first step is probably the most difficult one, but as soon as that is done, people will be motivated extrinsically as well as intrinsically by all the results that they get from the insects. So that's probably something to pass along, or to find not trying to influence people, but to give them that spark, maybe, like to initiate that spark and joy of having that biodiversity around, and then being happy about getting visitors in your garden or something like that.
It's been interesting in lockdown in the last few months. I think a lot of people have noticed insects almost for the first time because they haven't been quite so busy. They've been at home. They've actually had the chance. And it's what I find really fascinating is that some people manage to live their whole life. Sometimes even keen gardeners live their whole life without ever really stopping, getting down on their hands and knees and watching the insects that are in their garden, the bumblebees, the hoverflies, the grasshoppers, or whatever they might be. They just never find the time. And actually, as you say, if you do start looking at them, they're kind of addictive. They're really fascinating, and they're cute, they're beautiful, they're so interesting. And there's a whole world there waiting for people to discover. But it's just getting them as that first thing, as you say, just getting them to bite in the first place, to show some interest. And once you've got that, then often it just runs away with itself, and they become totally addicted to the whole thing. But it's just getting people to stop and find a few minutes in the first place, and that's surprisingly hard. But we can get there.
Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you so much, Dave, for taking the time today and for such an interesting talk. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I hope you got inspired and are now an instinct lover and up for more biodiversity in the world. If you want to stay up to date, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel or our newsletter. And our next talk next week is going to be about waste management in cities and about sustainable packaging. Thank you very much. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.